Chapter 7. It was midday when Lucian rode into Kingsport. The place had changed some, but many things had not. Taking in the sights and the smells, memory of a past life flooded his mind. It had been 18 years since he last laid eyes upon the capital. The night of the rebellion and the death of Suri, once repressed, was now refreshed with the sight of the city. He had hoped he would never see this cursed place again. New streets had been laid with polished cobblestone and brick. Luxurious shops and 3-story buildings had been erected. Lucian noticed an abundance of wealthy people wearing fine clothing, casually walking the streets. It's still a shithole, Lucian thought. After stabling his horse, he made his way through the crowded streets. Beggars and poor folk were still plenty in the capital, greeting him with either an outstretched palm or a scornful glare. Vendors and artisans lined both sides of the street. They stood behind their tents and tables, soliciting to anyone with coin. Some were crafting, and some were shouting at the people passing by in an attempt to sell their goods. The smell of cooked meat made his mouth water, while a stand full of fresh fruit and vegetables caught his eye. Various arts and handmade crafts could be had for the right price, along with all types of clothing, weapons, and armor. Livestock for sale added to the noise and the smell of the place. Lucian made his way to one of the vendors. "How much?" he said, holding a skewer filled with a sizable portion of meat. "2," the merchant replied, taking a coin from another customer. "John's blessing to you, good sir," he said to the customer with a nod. Lucian handed him the coin, holding the stick up in appreciation. "John's blessing to you also, good sir," the merchant said, but not before Lucian turned and walked away. He made his way to the main courtyard, in front of the royal steps. No one, save for King George, the order, and the priests, were allowed onto the steps without approval. Savoring the succulent meat, Lucian looked up at the king's palace. Statues of previous kings lined the sides of the steps, standing proud, filling the space between 2 evergreen trees. Lucian's gaze veered to the right, toward the church. Standing taller and more grand than the king's palace, it had been hailed as the holy cornerstone of the religion. Eyeing the sheer size of the church, Lucian sucked air through his teeth upon finishing the meat. He pulled some tobacco from his pouch and put it in his mouth, enjoying a good chew from time to time. One of the guards cautiously eyed him from the steps. Lucian grinned in reply, his right cheek bulging out. "Lucian?" A man's voice came from behind. Turning, Lucian faced the man. "It is you?" the man asked. "I haven't seen you in years." "Hello, Thomas," Lucian said, gripping the man's hand. "Yes, it's been a few. From the looks of you, time has been treating you well," Lucian said, admiring his fine clothing and jewelry. Thomas turned one of the rings in his hand. "Yes, well, after the split, I found being a jeweler was much more profitable." "Jeweler? In a time like this?" Lucian said. "I thought people would be suffering here, like they are in the rest of the kingdom, due to the king's taxes." "Times are tough, my friend," Lucian said, scratching his chin. "But there will always be rich people to go with the poor. Actually, in times like these, it is the rich that prosper more." "How do you figure that?" Lucian asked. "They have enough money to invest, so they corner the markets. They raise or lower prices depending on who gains and at what time." "Gotta have money to make money," Lucian noted. Thomas nodded. "Sadly, it is the middle class that suffers. The artisans, trade workers, craftsmen. The gap between the rich and the poor is widening." Lucian tapped his toe on a newly paved street. "From the looks of the city as a whole, one would think that hundreds of kings lived here." Thomas laughed. "That's the king's tax money at work. He felt that it would keep the rich and politicians happy, despite taking a bit more coin from their purse." He waved his arm in a sweeping motion. "Promote a good image of the capital with new shops, buildings, and streets to reassure the public that the economy is better than it seems. Looks good, right? You can polish a turd, but it's still a turd, Lucian said, then spat a mouthful of brown near the palace steps. Hey! A nearby guard said, appalled by the vulgar disregard. I'll see to it, Thomas said, waving the guard off. Don't let it happen again, the guard warned. Lucian shrugged. Huh, I see you haven't changed much, Thomas said. I see you have, Lucian said, patting Thomas on the stomach. All that training, just to let yourself go. Thomas's face flushed red. Well, like I said, after the rebellion, I put my sword away. And picked up a fork, Lucian jeered. A man's got to eat. How long are you in town for? Lucian's face grew stern. Not long. Do you have a place to stay? No, I just arrived. Then it's settled, Thomas stated. You must stay with me and my family for the night. Lucian waved him off. It's all right. I'll just check into the inn. I insist, Thomas said, putting his arm around Lucian. Besides, my wife is baking a meat pie. It's the best this side of Greenhaven. Lucian thought about it. He was here to do a job. Better not to get involved with anyone. Thomas had been one of his good friends for years, serving alongside him in the order, but it had been a while since he talked to a friend. You got ale? Lucian asked. You still drink it piss warm? Thomas asked. Lucian smiled. Thomas clapped him on the back, pulling him towards the market. Some things never change. Lucian followed Thomas to his house on the outskirts of the inner city, only a brief walk from the market. Already, the buildings became more run down, and the folk grew less savory. Nice neighborhood, Lucian said with sarcasm, noticing the sharp decline in civilization across the street. It gets worse the farther you go, Thomas said. It's not a place someone wants to go be after dark. They walked the rest of the way as quickly and unassumingly as they could. Thomas's house was large, but not over-exaggerant. Upon entering, he insisted that Lucian make himself at home. Lucian chuckled to himself. He'd never known a real home. Feeling a bit out of place, he walked around the main room, gazing at all the furniture and decorations. It was after meeting Thomas's family that he eventually eased into the comfort of his host's home. So, what do you think about the meat pie? Thomas asked, sitting at the head of the dinner table. His 3 sons had been staring at their guest upon his arrival. It's the best I've ever had, Lucian said, with a mouthful of food, drawing a snicker from the children. Thomas's wife, Jenny, smiled. You are too kind, she said. My husband brags on me too much. And for good reason, Lucian replied. It's best to give credit where credit is due. My wife is too modest, Thomas said, picking at his teeth. It's because of her that I look like this, he said, stretching back while rubbing his belly. I've heard a key to a man's happiness is through his stomach, Lucian said. Well, Jenny said, looking at her husband, are you happy? Oh, I'm happy, he said, and slapped his gut, drawing laughs from around the table. Jenny shook her head and stood to clear the table. Come, boys, let's clean and let these 2 catch up. Yes, Mama, the oldest boy, just 10, said. The youngest looked at Lucian, sizing him up. Are you a jeweler, like my dad? Joey, Thomas scolded, you know better. When we have company, you are only to speak when spoken to. Yes, Father, the boy said with his head down. It's all right, Lucian said, drawing the boy's gaze again. I am no jeweler, but I do like to deal a little in rare stones. Thomas's expression turned stark as he regarded his guest. The boy cocked his head. If you're not a jeweler, then what do you do for work? Joey, go help your mother and get ready for bed, Thomas commanded. Jumping from his chair, the boy ran into the kitchen. Lucian smiled. Cute kid. Reminds me of me at that age. For heaven's sake, let's hope not, Thomas said, standing from the table. Let's talk in private. In the back room, Thomas poured a glass of whiskey for each of them. Lucian took the drink, nodding his appreciation, and shot it down, savoring the burn. Now that's damn good whiskey, he noted, inspecting the empty glass. I only drink the best, Thomas said. Funny how things change. When we were young, we would have drunk horse piss just to get a buzz. He slowly emptied his glass, closing his eyes, then swallowed. As you get older, you learn to appreciate the finer things in life, he stated, his voice slightly chafed from the fiery drink. 2 more glasses were poured as Lucian looked around the room. No expense was spared. It was decorated from floor to ceiling with only the best that money could buy. I'll have to admit, you have a mighty fine life, Lucian said, taking a sip from his glass. You've done well for yourself, Thomas. Credit it to hard work and a little bit of luck, Thomas said. And how about you? Lucian stood in front of a wall decorated with magnificent swords. An assortment of bows hung above the blades. What about me? I hate to be rude like my boy, but what is it that you do these days? Same thing I've always done, Thomas, Lucian said, admiring the weapons. But why? Thomas asked. Lucian turned. Because I'm damn good at it. That's why. I know you are, Lucian, but you can be good at other things too. Aren't you tired of taking orders? Of course I am. Then why do you do it? Thomas pleaded. You know why, Lucian said, raising his voice. He lowered his eyes, checking himself. I don't know why I feel like I owe it to her, but I do. Listen, I know you hate the order and everything that happened, but Sari would want you to be a better man. God wants you to be. Leave God out of this, Lucian spat. We parted ways long time ago. And leave Sari out of it too, he threatened. I know we're old friends, but don't press your luck. You're right, Thomas said, putting a hand up. I go too far. Lucian walked away in an effort to calm himself. It's the church that goes too far, he said, turning back. Thomas cocked his head, his face puzzled. Since you brought God up, Lucian replied to the look. Go on then, since you clearly have an opinion, Thomas said. The priests have their hidden agendas and push for money and power, all in the name of God, Lucian scorned. And they use the order to impose their will in the name of King George and the church. The church and what it stands for is holy and for the glory of God, Thomas retorted. But I will agree that man has corrupted it and abuses its authority. Well, at least we agree on that, Lucian said. What I do not agree with is this new religion they are pushing on people, Thomas stated, then drained his glass. What new religion? Lucian asked. I'm surprised you haven't heard. The priests tell the people that the church is their savior and that they should worship it instead of God. Under what right? Lucian said. Thomas shook his head. Under the king's right. He has been appointed the title of spiritual leader, while the high priest is his chief advisor. The people won't stand for that, Lucian said. The faith is as old as time. There are some who have already converted, Thomas sighed. I guess they had no choice. Horse shit, Lucian spat. What do you mean they had no choice? The people are starving, Lucian. The money is scarce, especially since the king raised the taxes. Why would he raise the taxes in a struggling economy? Lucian noted. It makes no sense. For the king's generosity. Lucian shook his head and drank. So a taxing king is a generous king? He said. He claimed the taxes are for the greater good of the church, Thomas said, throwing his arms up. The king is generous by giving the people food and shelter. Unfortunately, they are now dependent upon it. And dependency leads to obedience, Lucian stated, and then emptied his glass. Yes, it does, Thomas said. But the great thing about this life is that a man always has a choice. Right or wrong, good or evil, you have the freedom to choose. Nobody can take that away. Thomas tapped his head. Sadly, people do not like to choose, given that the choice is too hard. They sacrifice their freedom and rely on others to make the choices for them. There has to be those who are opposed to this, Lucian said. Many are already becoming upset, even hostile, due to the king's new taxes, Thomas said. But they are kept at bay by the king's generosity. Lucian stared into his empty glass. Well, I have a big day tomorrow. Let's call it a night, Thomas said, then showed Lucian to his room. It's good to see you, old friend, Thomas said with a smile, then closed the door. Lucian dropped his gear on the floor by the bed. He pulled the black silk bag from his pack and untied the strings. As he opened the pouch, red and gray light spilled forth, emanating from the two stones. The colors illuminated his face, reflecting in his eyes. He tied the pouch shut and laid it on the bed. Thomas's words ran through his head. He knew he had a choice. He had the power to do whatever he wanted. He was death. He thought about running, starting a new life somewhere, far away. He could take a wife, have a house full of children, and make an honest living. The image of Cerise suddenly flashed in his mind. He imagined she stood in darkness, holding the path of man. Now his thoughts turned to the night of the rebellion, the night he had killed Cerise and joined the dark society. What made him choose to join the society? Did he even have a choice? Victor flashed through his mind, consuming his thoughts. The master. Lucian had obeyed him without question. He chose to. It was to see their goal achieved, the destruction of the order. Sometimes you don't have a choice, Lucian thought, as he stared at the candle beside his bed, watching the flame dance. Sometimes you gotta run with the devil. He snuffed the wick, and the room fell into darkness.